Good evening all and welcome. Do you believe in ghosts or the afterlife? Well, these people certainly did, as they believe that their loved ones or relatives have called them from beyond the grave, as we're about to find out. So get comfortable, make sure your phone is charged, and let the darkness take control. My father was a journalist. In 1980 to 1981, I was around 3 years old. He would have been around 30. He was a hard-working and honest man with a lot of good friends. And at 2 a.m., we receive a call on our big black landline phone. It was his friend who had got into an accident on the highway. He said he was calling from a 24-hour STD booth near the site. The friend also asked him to bring a big white bedsheet for him. At the time, there were no mobile phones, so my father set out alone in a jeep and took a water bottle with the bedsheet. My parents were wondering what the bedsheet was for. My father reached the site. There were no streetlights and he couldn't find his friend or his scooter. He couldn't find the STD booth too. So he traveled for 5 more kilometers and found a police station. He contacted the cops there and told them the story. The cops took big torches and went with him in search of his friend. Finally, they find the scooter slid down on the one side of the highway, with the middle part of his body clean slit down horizontally. He had been dead for at least 5 hours. My father had received the call after his friend's death. It was then it hit my father that in our religion, the white bedsheet is used to cover the dead body. We call it kafan. Perhaps the friend was hinting that he was dead, and the white bedsheet would be required to cover him. My father couldn't sleep for weeks and hated talking about the incident. When I was 12, my grandmother passed away, and I really loved her as she practically raised me since I was very young, as my parents were divorced and mother had to work. It was around 1999. I was now living in the same house with my mum and sister. We used to hang around the main room watching movies, and most of the time fell asleep on Sundays. Well, one day while we're sleeping, the phone rings, and I pick up the call. It was very noisy, but there was a woman on the other side, and they called me by my name, and she just said, "Open the window." I said, "Who is this?" "Open the window," she replied. "Why, who is this?" "I'm your grandma, open the window," and then hung up. After that, and still startled, I think it must have been the wrong number, I start walking back to the room and walked past the kitchen and suddenly smelled gas leaking. I hurried to open the windows, then woke up my mum and told her, and she said it was the first time she saw me truly scared. I still don't know what truly happened. It might have been a wrong number, but the chances of that were just so unlikely. Around the time I was 19, I was deployed in Iraq. My unit worked bombs, and honestly I didn't know I would make it home intact. About halfway through my tour, the Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week, I was back on a plane in the States. Now, my dad being ill was something I had grown used to. He was strong though, and I never expected to actually lose him. I lost my mother when I was 7, and my father's lungs had collapsed shortly before then. He was on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to go anywhere. Medication by the handfuls were needed every few hours, and he gained weight from the limited movement, developed diabetes, and had already beaten cancer once. I never expected to lose him, and he wasn't the type to ever give up. I arrive home, head to the hospital, and he assures me he's fine and that they're overreacting. I visit him every day I'm there, but he tells me he'll be fine by the time I get home for good. I reluctantly go back overseas. I call his hospital whenever I have a few minutes of free time and we're near a call center. My deployment finishes, and he keeps his promise. He comes home from the hospital because he says he doesn't want to die there. He gets worse and goes back. The family all visits, but we all know he isn't improving. One day I'm at home and the phone rings. It's an unknown number, so I don't answer it, and it goes to the answering machine. A very raspy voice mumbles, "Call the hospital." It's my dad. I grab the phone, but he's already hung up. So I call. They tell me he's been intubated for the past few hours, and he just started going into cardiac arrest. He's non-responsive, and we need to come and say our goodbyes. I argue that he just called me, and she says that's not possible. They've been working on him for some time now. I hang up and told my family the news. My sister and I stared at the answering machine. We played the tape again and again. That was the last time I heard my father's voice. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in the ghosts or paranormal, but I can't come up with a logical explanation, and I still get watery-eyed every time I think about it. About 20 years ago, my best friend at the time and his wife had her father, Felix, living with them. They were his caretakers. They pretty much did everything for him, and that included cleaning him every morning because of his incontinence and difficulty holding his bowels. They did a really good job and deserving my compliments several times. One day my friend Mike went into Felix's room, where he would normally be awakening, only to find him in full rigor mortis. Felix had sadly passed sometime in the night. I was employed at the time as a cemetery pre-need salesman, but also could arrange at-need services, and so I did. I helped them to prepare Felix's final resting location and waived my commission as I didn't feel right charging the two individuals who had done so much to make Felix's last years comfortable. About a week later we held the service, at which I officiated, and it was well attended, and we gave Felix the send-off he deserved. I rode home in the limo provided for the family by the funeral home/cemetery. After the service, we all sat around for a while just decompressing and taking a well-needed break. The wife, Mary, then noticed that there were messages on her answering machine, as this was during the time we had physical landlines and attached answering machines. She pressed the play button, and the timestamp on the machine read at the identical time as to when we had the graveside service for Felix, 11 a.m. When the recording started, every jaw in the room suddenly dropped, and an honest-to-goodness chill filled it. There were 5 of us present: Mike, Mary the daughter, myself, my brother James, and a friend of theirs from across the street whose name I did not know. The background noise was the first thing we heard. It sounded like someone was in a room with a large group of people. You know, lots of audible voices, but nothing we could completely discern. Then Felix spoke. The voice on the recording was clearly and unmistakably him. "Please don't follow me," was what it said on the recording, and then it stopped. We had what seemed like a recently deceased parent calling during his own funeral service, begging us to please not follow him. Don't follow him into death? Not possible. Don't follow his life choices? He had made many bad ones, including a brief stint in prison for a relatively minor offense. Here's the one his daughter thought was his intent. Don't follow me into hell. She believed until her dying day that her father had made contact one last time, telling her to not follow his path and end up where he did once he took that step into the unknown journey called death. 20 years later, and I remember that moment, and the stunned silence, shock, and fear of the moment, just like it happened yesterday. What do you think? To this day, I'm certain the phone call was indeed contact from Felix in the afterlife. My daughter was a newborn, and I was a sleep-deprived mother. The phone rang at 3 a.m. and woke up my husband and I. He got up to answer it, and as he left the room I felt something under me. I was laying across my baby. I must have taken her to bed and fell asleep. It is exactly what parents are warned about, and I feel awful. Awful I made this mistake. My daughter was fine. I must have only rolled onto her, and my husband returned to the bedroom saying it was someone speaking in a language he didn't understand. We were very shaken up, and I took precautions to ensure it never happened again. My daughter is 18 now, and likes to think she had a guardian angel who saved her that night. This is an experience that happened to me when I was in high school. To this day, I can't explain it. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had a boyfriend who was 2 years older than me. He was all set up to go to boot camp for the Marine Corps when he graduated. We definitely were in puppy love, and he was my first serious boyfriend. The time came and he graduated. He was going to spend the summer with his dad in California, and I was going to spend the summer with my dad in Pennsylvania. At the end of summer is when he would ship out to basic training in MCRD San Diego. Over the summer we would talk, but we had a fight and ended up breaking up. I can't even remember what it was about. We stopped talking for a while. He went to basic, and then went to infantry training, and then he was deployed to Iraq. He was there for a few months and he emailed me. I returned the email and we spoke a few times every week. One of the conversations we had was about us breaking up, and we ended up arguing about it. After that, I stopped getting emails from him. I thought he was just mad at me. It was then my senior year, and I was doing a project for my American government class on the war in Iraq. I came across the casualty page and I saw his picture. It was towards the top because his last name starts with A. I was shocked and I lost it. I saw that he died the day after our last conversation. I couldn't believe that no one got in touch with me to tell me. I reached out to his mum, and she told me he got rid of anything and everything that reminded him of me. He threw away papers with my numbers on it and said that she tried to find me, but she couldn't. I personally think if she tried harder, she would have been able to, but she was a grieving mother who lost her son, and I was probably the last thing on her mind. I asked her how he passed, and she told me he was the gunner on top of the Humvee, and while on patrol, a group of insurgents tried to ram them off the road. The driver of the Humvee swerved and flipped the Humvee and landed on my ex. Fast forward a few months of grieving him, drinking, drug use, and crying. One night I was home with my mum. Me and her got into an argument, and I called my friend Tori and told her to come and collect me so that I could stay the night with her. She told me that she was out to dinner with her parents but would call me when she was done. I left my phone on the charger upstairs because it was dying. I went back downstairs, talked things out with my mum, and we ended up watching a movie. I went upstairs after the movie had ended, and I had 5 missed calls from Tori. I called her back, and she said, "Hey, is Rob with you?" He's our other friend. I told her no, that it was just me and my mum. My stepdad was at work. She claimed someone answered my phone. I told her that was impossible, my phone was upstairs and charging. She freaked out and yelled, "Oh my God, I think I spoke to a dead guy." I asked her what she meant. She said he answered the phone and said hello. She asked if I was there and he said I was busy at the moment. And she asked if he could pass on the message that she had called. He just replied, "Dandy," as in fine and dandy. That instantly gave me chills, because that is something my ex-boyfriend used to say a lot. I asked her if she was sure she called my phone, and she said she looked at the phone and it said, "Connected, Ailish." I hung up the phone and checked through my call logs. And sure enough, right there was confirmation that there was a call that lasted 23 seconds. To this day, I can't explain it. After that happened, there were a few times that the thermostat outside my room would be turned all the way down without anyone touching it, and my house was a newer home. I work for a company that answers phone calls and takes messages for businesses when they're closed, out to lunch, or after hours. We answer for a variety of companies in different fields, including funeral homes. This situation has happened twice, and I've talked to the person myself on the phone, and a few other times as well. I think it's very interesting. The first time it happened, I took the message from a lady whose mother had passed recently. The body was already picked up and dressed at the funeral parlor. Visitation was scheduled for the next day. She calls and is weepy, and asks if her mother's phone is still in her jacket pocket, because they just got a call from her number. I end up dispatching the call, as in calling the director to deliver the message verbally, and he says that he'll call her, but the body is in the casket and the casket is closed, waiting in the parlor. I say, "Wow, weird," and he kind of chuckles and says, "This kind of thing happens more often than you'd think." It's been a year or more since that call, and just yesterday I got another similar call from a funeral home, and other people I work with have the same type of stories. I just wanted to get some outside opinions, because it's both interesting and creepy. My father stayed at his friend's house one night because of work. The next morning he wanted to check in on us, so he dialed our telephone. Some guy answered. He said things like, "Shame on you. How could you stay at someone else's house knowing that your wife and 2 daughters are home alone? Have you lost your mind? Are you a father of 2? Stop being so stupid and come home." The guy kept on saying such things. My father didn't understand what happened. He asks him his name, but the phone cut. My father thought it could be one of his family members visiting our home. It's the only explanation he could think of. He called the lady living on the 2nd floor to check on us, as we lived on the 3rd, so she climbed all the stairs to see there was no one home. Yes, the house was locked, but my mother and I were at my sister's school paying her fees, so no one was home at the time. Even if we assume my father called a different number, it doesn't make sense. I mean, come on, he knew my father's name, he knew he had 2 daughters, he knew our family. And still to this date, I don't know who the guy was. My father says it sounded like his older brother. He's the only one who would scold him like that. But it just so happened he died about 4 months before the phone incident. I still get chills whenever I think about it. When I was 16, my friend stayed the night at my house. At the time, I was really into the paranormal and had just learned about electronic voice phenomena, or EVP. That night we had just watched the Mothman prophecies before going to sleep. I remember it was storming outside and there was thunder and lightning. Before going to sleep, I had set up a microphone on my PC to record sounds because my house had some weird things happen in the past, and watching that movie pumped me to get an EVP that night. I start the recording and test the mic. I could see spikes on the track when we spoke, and I specifically remember seeing a huge spike when some thunder rattled the house. The next morning I stopped the recording and noticed that there was only 4 hours of audio, but we'd been asleep for nearly 8. I began listening to the audio, and it seemed normal at first. I could hear the conversation we had right after starting the recording, but no longer saw the big spike from the thunder, which I initially dismissed. Upon further inspection, I see a spike on the track about 2 hours in, so roughly 3 a.m. I moved to that section of the track and hit play. In the recording, I could hear what was obviously my cell phone ringing, but only partial selections of the ringtone. It rang 3 or 4 times, and then I clearly hear an unfamiliar voice say, "Hello," in a hushed tone. I grabbed my phone and checked the recent call log, and the last call I received was earlier the previous day when my friend called and asked to hang out. No incoming or outgoing since. My brain exploded. I immediately called my friend's phone to see if his ringtone was the same. It wasn't. He woke up looking confused about getting a call from across the room when I explained what I found and played the audio. He was clearly a bit shaken and shied away from any paranormal conversation I tried to initiate from then on. In addition to the weird phone call and missing thunder throughout the recording, were short sections of audio with a quiet but obvious train horn. This wouldn't have been weird because my house was very near a busy railway. However, this was more like an old school train whistle rather than a modern horn which I'd never heard in my entire life living there. Later, that day, when I heard a train go by, I tried to record the sound with the same gear, thinking the sound was somehow distorted. But what I found was that the horn was barely audible. This was strange because the train whistle in the EVP was loud enough to make a visible spike on the track recording. I was at work one day about a year after my brother had passed away, when my phone rang, and there was a man on the other end sounding bewildered. It was as if he thought he had called the wrong number. After my perky greeting of, "Thank you for calling Woolworths. This is Jude. How may I help you?" the man hesitated. He said, "I'm trying to find my sister." I said that he had reached the place of business and may have called the wrong number, and I disconnected the call. I told my colleague about it right away, and it was odd. The caller actually did sound like my deceased brother. He called again and repeated, "I'm trying to find my sister. I'm supposed to bring someone to her." This time the call dropped from their end. Well, of note, the location of my office was kind of a hotspot for the paranormal. The colleague I mentioned, Liz, had a desk on my left. Behind her, a mere 5 feet away, our manager had a tiny cubicle with a partition. Our manager was on vacation and another manager was filling in for her, Sissy. She has a very distinct accent, and Liz and I were working when we heard Sissy say from behind the partition, "Hey Liz, come see me as soon as you can." Liz stood up, stepped behind the partition, and there was no one there at all. Within a moment, Liz received a phone call that her father lay dying in Jamaica. We're in California. He wanted Liz to come see me as soon as you can. My father's mother died back in 1999. She had congestive heart failure for a number of years, and one day her heart gave out so she didn't suffer. The night she died, I went over to the local hospital to see her and didn't get a chance to say goodbye a few days later because we had the funeral and buried her and went on with our normal routine. 3 days after she died, I went to town and came back home and noticed that my landline answering machine was on, and there was a message because it was flashing. I played it, and it was just her voice saying goodbye. My great-grandmother always said throughout her life that if there were something after death, she would give a sign. She died alone in a nursing home, and after a very long day we all returned to her family home with her husband, my great-grandfather. We stayed with him that night so that he wasn't alone. Long story short, we all went to bed around midnight, when not long after the phone began to ring. There's no one on the other end. This happened a few times. In the UK, you can dial 1471 to trace the call. The call was untraceable. This happened a few times before it ended. This, as a skeptic, was the first time I'd considered something to be unexplainable. It brought great comfort to my family, so paranormal or not, We like to think that it was my great-grandmother, saying that this is the only sign I could send, and that I am okay. My entire family decided to drive and stay in Mexico for a week. While there, my brother picked up a SIM to use within Mexico. Right after we started using it, we received a text message from a random number. The bottom of the message said, "Love Oma and Opa," German words for grandma and grandpa, which we called my grandparents. The message talked about how much they loved us and missed us and hoped the trip was going well. I would like to think it was a loving message from beyond, but the rational part of me says it must be a freaky coincidence. Right? My mum passed on May 16th, and while my dad was making arrangements, he lost his phone in the funeral home. Just as he realized this, we heard it ringing, and it was my mum's number on the ID. He didn't reach for it fast enough to answer, and no one left a message, but my mum was always worried about him losing his phone and not being able to reach him. We both think it was her trying to help. Her phone was back at the house, locked up inside, and wasn't charged before we left to follow her body to the funeral home. It had looked like it was trying to find some number for the family that my dad didn't have, but I didn't even get to plug it in before we left to start the process of planning the funeral. My parents lived in this trailer on my grandparents' property that sat directly behind an old cemetery. Some of the oldest graves were dated to around 1760, but most other people that died in the 1800s and early 1900s. It was very run down and, of course, creepy. The cemetery was small, about the size of a football field's end zone, with tall distorted tombstones shaped in semi-human form, but mostly really plain graves, with small engraved stones. Plus, this land had the arrowheads and other Indian tools everywhere on it, and you could find stuff when they plowed the fields. My dad was in the trailer, which was behind the cemetery, when the phone rang and he answered it. It was a static-filled call that was garbled, which was odd for a landline in the 70s before wireless became popular. He said it sounded like a field telephone, whatever that is, and on the other line was an older woman, with an old-timey voice, wanting to speak with Liz Plummer. He told the woman that she must have the wrong number, and she got aggravated, assuring him that she was there and to give Lizzie the phone. The woman had nothing to say besides reassuring my dad that Lizzie was there and demanding to speak with her in an increasingly aggravated tone after being told multiple times she had the wrong number. The woman would just repeat, "I know she's there. I want to talk to Lizzie. She's there." And my dad gave up and hung up the phone. A few days later, my dad was de-weeding around the tombstones. After he was done, he looked at some of the older graves and stopped in his tracks. Running through his body was a chill as he looked down at a grave with the name Elizabeth Plummer chiseled into it. It could be just a coincidence, but it's freaky to think because it's directly in front of the house. They were spooked for many nights after that. This incident in particular happened late one night in my grandma-in-law's kitchen. Grandma had a sister-in-law who was visiting from the East Coast. She'd gotten in late that night, and I went over to visit the two of them with my husband. We were all just sitting around the kitchen table, the same one my grandfather-in-law's mother had owned when she built the house. There was a lot of jokes going around the table, and my grandma started coughing and laughing too hard. Now, she was in poor health and was supposed to be taking breathing treatment. However, with her having so much fun, a rare occasion since my grandpa passed, she didn't want to leave the table. My husband was concerned and told her that she had to take her breathing treatment. After some convincing, she got up and started heading in that direction. But when she got sucked back into the conversation and distracted from her treatment, She again started coughing heavily. This was the moment my husband told her she needed to take her treatment. "If Grandpa saw you right now, he'd be nagging at you to do it," my husband told her. "That's right," my grandma's sister-in-law said. "Don't make me have him call you." Grandma gave a little, "yeah, right" kind of chuckle. When right at that moment the sister-in-law's track phone that she only uses for traveling started to ring. We all stood there for a moment, and the sister-in-law went to answer it. It immediately disconnected, and she opened it after several rings. The weirdest part was it was around 11:30 East Coast time, on a phone that no one would have the number to outside my immediate family. Grandma immediately took her breathing treatment after that, not wanting to argue with what could have been a message from beyond the grave. Her husband had always reminded her of the treatment while alive, so it wouldn't be that unusual for him to do the same now. A few years ago, when we were getting ready to head up to the camp to celebrate my grandpa's 90th birthday, some weird things had started going on with my aunt, who ultimately ended up not going. A few days later, we'd gotten back from camp. No one was able to get in touch with her. A wellness check was done and the police came to inform us that she had passed away. Just before the police arrived, the house phone rang long distance, which meant that it was my aunt who was calling. My mother happened to pick up, said hello a few times and then told the caller to shove their goodbye. The next day at dinner, the phone rang long distance again. My mind immediately went to my aunt. I was the one to answer this time. It was completely dead silence on the line. I was just about to hang up when a very small female voice said, "Goodbye," and the line went dead. This happened a few more times over the next few days. My mother received the call again, my sister on her cell phone, and then my cousin, my aunt's son, on his. This call happened when we were all together, and they all were exactly the same. It may have been a coincidence, or could it have been my aunt, giving us one final goodbye. In 2016, my grandfather, who may as well have been my father, passed away. He lived in a small house which I had shared for a few years, not too long before his passing, in a small town I live in the south of Ireland. His passing was quite devastating to myself and my family, and for that reason childhood memories and connections to the house made it quite difficult for us to visit. Fast forward to Halloween 2 years ago, and the Hoover we used at home broke, and we didn't exactly have the money to go buy new things at the drop of a hat. My mother was thinking to go to my grandfather's house to get one from there. To spare her the emotional journey in the house, I volunteered to go and asked a longtime friend of mine who I knew at the house to accompany me. We arrive at the house at about midday, maybe as late as 2 p.m. I go inside and nothing is out of the ordinary, just silent and hollow, with a void where my granddad used to be. My friend Harry, who I'd known since about 6th class, so 8 years now, used to come over all the time. He knew the household and my family inside out. We walked around the house in a sort of nostalgic silence, speaking occasionally about memories we'd shared there years before. Eventually we made it to the back door of the house and out into the garden, where a trampoline and a wooden shed where we used to play stood, still containing old things from our past. And this is where the main event of the day came. Having finished looking around there, we turned to go inside, and as I locked the shed door and the garden gate, me and Harry heard a phone ring. I didn't think anything of it, as I had seen the next door neighbor's door back open, only a few moments before, and assumed it was theirs. That was until Harry called my name and I turned to look at him. He was standing right at the back door of the house. While I was about 5 meters further away, he stared at me blankly and said, "The phone?" "Yes, the neighbors," I say. "No, it's inside the house." I was confused and followed him in. When I entered the kitchen, I stood next to Harry, beside my grandfather's chair where he sat every day for as long as I could remember. Next to the chair was a small wooden table with a landline sitting on it, and it was ringing. We looked at each other shocked.
The phone line had been disconnected for more than 2 years, and the electricity was disconnected too, although I think it can still run without it. Harry picked up the phone and answered, repeating, "Hello?" and holding the phone out for me to come over and take it. I did, and spoke hello into the receiver a few times, but I was not greeted with a response. All I could hear was a slight static, and that tone you would get if you had a wired landline, the one you'd hear when you'd pick up and listen before dialing any numbers. After a few moments I hung up the phone and left for a short while, and picked it up again hearing the same tone, and nothing else. I picked it up and put it down maybe 6 or 7 times before leaving it, and realizing the phone line was not only disconnected, but was also plugged out from the wall. Me and Harry decided to try and call the phone from his mobile, but it didn't ring, and instead we got the tone that indicates an invalid number. We tried again a few times to no avail, and then tried to call both our mobiles from the house phone. After dialing the numbers, neither of our phones rang, nor did the phone sound indicate it had dialed, or that it was ringing. A few minutes more passed, and we were sitting down, wondering what was going on, until I picked up the phone again and all the noise had gone, and as many times as I had picked it up it never came back. This was very confusing and emotional for me. I'd consider myself a bit of a soft touch, but my friend would always be a much hardier type. It takes a lot for him to get upset. We both sat there in tears, wondering if this was some sort of sign from my grandpa. It's been 2 years, and on that occasion I've been back to the house. I always pick up the phone and hear the same dead silence. My family has always been somewhat sensitive to the paranormal. More than a few of us have unexplained instances, but nothing like what happened a few years back. It was 2000, and while the world survived YK2, unfortunately my great-grandmother did not. A few months after her death, every few days we would receive phone calls from a number that's ID was just a string of zeros. Every time we picked it up, it was white noise like the TV channels that didn't come in right. The first few times we simply assumed that there was something going on with the phone lines and disregarded it. However, for whatever reason, we always picked it up. Now, for those of you young'uns on Reddit, the year 2000 was a different time. Cell phones were new, and most people still had landlines. The worst part was the fact that almost all of the internet was dial-up, meaning a simple phone call could interrupt the song you spent the fast 5 hours downloading on LimeWire. So obviously these white noise calls became an annoyance very quickly. Finally, my mother called the phone company to see if they could see where it was coming from. Well, once the phone company investigated the number, they discovered the calls were coming from a payphone, but not just any payphone. This payphone happened to be located right outside the cemetery, where we had a few short months ago laid my granny to rest. Not only that, but the payphone was disconnected from use a few years before, and wasn't even capable of making calls. This settles it for my family. We decided it was my granny, so every time the call came, we simply spoke to her the same way we always had. The calls continued for around 2 years at this point. I lived at the house in the area where tornadoes were rare, but when we had one, it tended to be incredibly damaging. One night, one came through the neighborhood causing a lot of damage. However, our home thankfully was spared. Not long after it passed, the phone rang. This time, however, instead of white noise, my mother swears she heard her ask if everyone was okay. Mum reassures her we're all fine and everything is okay. After that, the call stopped, and we all hope she's moved on to find her peace knowing we are fine. 10 years later, both my grandmother and grandfather have passed and been buried alongside the rest of our family. My mum decided to move into her parents' home. At the time, I was living with a boyfriend and we decided to stop by the cemetery so I could introduce him to my beloved grandparents. Once I get back into the car, I check my Facebook, and my mother only had 2 minutes before posting a photo of a phone showing the same 000 number and saying how after many years she's finally hearing from heaven again. I call her frantic because I'm literally just staring at their graves. She received the call while my ex and I were standing there. My only assumption to this day was that my family didn't really like my boyfriend and was willing to call beyond the grave to make that fact known. That was the last call we ever received, but not our last experience. To this day, we still have the same landline number, just in case they ever wish to call us back. When I was around 12, in the early 2000s, I was sitting in the living room with my grandpa when we heard a phone ring coming from the kitchen. I went and looked for the noise and found it was a cell phone ringing in a junk drawer. The thing is, the phone hadn't been used in years, the battery should have been dead, and there was a no cell service on the phone sign. I wrote the number down that was calling the phone and called it back on the landline. A man answered. I told him we had just missed a call from this number and asked if there was something I could help with. He told me he didn't make a phone call to anyone. The phone was right next to him, and he was the only person home at the time. We both found it very weird, and he seemed very creeped out as I was. Nothing like that ever happened since. A quick note though, that house burnt down in a fire sparked by a heating blanket about 5 years later. No one was hurt or injured though. My grandma always said that she could feel something sitting at the edge of her bed at night, but I lived in that house for 8 years and had never seen or heard anything. The heating blanket that sparked the fire was plugged in my grandparents' room when it started the fire. It's just all a bit weird, isn't it? I worked at a retirement home, and as you can imagine, people die here quite often. We would answer calls from residents on phones that we carried around in our pocket. One night I got a call for a room on the 4th floor. There were no occupants on the 4th floor, so I went to check because someone could have gotten lost or hurt. I get to the room and it's locked, no occupant, no furniture, except for what was stored in there. A room halfway through renovation and no power. So technically impossible for anyone to have called me from that room. I checked where my co-workers were, and they were all accounted for. They told me the last occupant had died in that room, and it had remained empty since. 2 years ago, I had started a summer job. I was going back to college, and then any job I could get during the summer would have been very desired. There was this warehouse that was needing people. It had recently opened and the owners were new to the area. The company was a family business, so everyone was related except myself. They were from out of the country, and many of them didn't understand nor spoke English. Well, one day while at work around 2 p.m. or so, a weird thing happened while I was on the phone with my cousin. I had gone to the restroom and my cousin happened to call me, and I answered the phone to hear his voice shouting, "Hey, hello, can you hear me?" I was answering him as to why he called me, and he kept saying, "Hello, hello." I grabbed my phone, pressed the speaker, and kept trying to talk to him, but he couldn't hear me. A weird woman's voice then came onto the phone, just like if she was the one calling me. For a few seconds I couldn't hear my cousin at all, but it was as if I couldn't hear his voice anymore. The woman's voice sounded like she was in agony, like she was hurt or something. After I heard that, I asked her, "Who are you? Are you okay? Do you need help? What do you want? Talk to me. Tell me, who are you?" I thought maybe she was in danger for some reason, reaching out to me via the phone. As I asked her that, the moaning grunt-like scream got louder. As the noise started getting louder, I put the call off the loudspeaker, and once again, I was trying to talk to whoever was on the line with me at this point. The noise lasted for 10 to 15 seconds, when I heard my cousin say, "Gonna call you back, can't hear you." He called me right back and the call was fine. I asked him if he heard the woman that I heard who was in agony. He told me he didn't or couldn't. When situations like this happen, I always wish whoever is in between would tell me what they want. But then again, it's all about the energy and the importance we give any situation. This happened 3 years ago now. It was pretty late at night, between 4 or 5 a.m. I fell asleep with my cell phone right beside me and I felt it vibrate. It wasn't that unusual for me to being woken up like this. On weekends I get up pretty late, and my parents call me to wake me up, or to make sure I'm up and getting ready to go to lunch somewhere. But it was in the middle of the night, and it came from my grandparents. I immediately answered, thinking there was some kind of actual emergency. My grandparents are 90 and 89, and my youngest uncle who lives with them has Down syndrome. They are pretty much vulnerable to a bunch of things. When I answered the phone, my grandpa was on the other side of the line, and his voice sounded as if he was answering the phone to me. And immediately I told him who I was and asked if everything was okay. He sounded confused, which I didn't think was a big deal. He had trouble hearing because of his age, and I thought he just forgot to put in his hearing aids. But then he started screaming and the phone call ended. All of this happened in the course of a minute or so. I immediately tried to call back, absolutely terrified of something happening to them. After 3 non-answered calls, I was on the edge of a panic attack, if not having one already. I got out of my room and woke up my dad. I told him what happened and showed him the call records on my phone so he couldn't brush it off, saying it was just a nightmare. I begged him to call them to make sure everything was okay. He told me he would do it and to go to bed, but I didn't sleep much that night. I was absolutely terrified, at times imagining the worst, but also analysing what happens and thinking of a logical explanation, but nothing made sense to me. My grandpa is not the most technological guy. He's pretty old school in that way. My grandma is the one that uses their cell phone or landline to communicate with us. I'm not really my grandpa's favourite. I don't know how I would be the first to be contacted if something happened. For me, it's pretty hard to comprehend how the man doesn't even know how to spell my name correctly or my phone number. I also have to add that my grandpa is a very respected doctor who has won several awards and is the most healthy person I've ever known. He hasn't lost any of his marbles, is pretty aware and conscious about his surroundings, and in the early morning my dad called my grandma, and she answered. Fortunately, everything was okay and my grandma assured him nobody called me that night. My dad kind of tried the "you were just dreaming" speech. But once again I showed him the call I received, and that I actually spoke to someone. He's a logical man and would try to give me an explanation, but this time he didn't even try. He was so freaked out he pretended this conversation never happened and carried on with the day. I made sure my family checked their cell phones to make sure that no one else was called that night, and it was just me who received the creepy call. I buried the memory in the remotest corner of my brain, hoping it would never pop up again, and I could just forget about it. This happened around 8 or 9 years ago. I was in a mall with my daughter, and as a weekend treat, decided to go to a local cake store to sample a slice of their chocolate mousse. A few minutes after getting seated, my phone rang. It said my sister was calling. She was at work at the time and was not allowed phones in the production area, so I was concerned it may be important. When I picked up and said hello, a really creepy, really oily voice I didn't recognize said, "Oh, so you're just here eating cake, are you?" I think I may have said a few other things, asked the name, why they were calling or something like that, and the voice just laughed. It was difficult to identify it as male or female. All I know was that it was really, really wrong. I looked around and remember thinking that I was probably a victim of one of those gag shows, but then again, why go through all the effort of using my sister's name and number for it? I hung up and looked at my daughter. She was eating the cake. The people around us were minding their own business, and the world stayed the same. I told my sister after, and she had no idea what happened. There was no log on her phone that she had dialed me. So what happened? About a week after my great-grandmother passed away, I was over visiting with my grandparents, and we were all sitting around talking as usual, with nothing out of the ordinary. Well, suddenly their landline phone rings, and the number on the caller ID shows no name and only the number 0000. My granddad does this joke when he gets a weird phone call, he doesn't recognize it, and says, "I don't know anyone named those numbers," and lets the answering machine get it. So a minute later it shows that ominous number left a message on the answering machine, and we play it. The message plays and there's about 10 seconds of static noise, like someone has a bad connection, and then it stops, and we hear a woman say, "I love you." And we all immediately turned and looked. and didn't say a word. A few more seconds of static followed those words and the message ended. You'll recognize the voice, belonging to my great-grandmother. What adds to my belief was that she had this weird thing where she would never say the words "I love you" to anyone. She was a sweet lady, but something about those words she would never even say, even if you said it to her. So I believe she regretted it and needed to pass on the message to my granddad. Nothing else happened since, but I will always remember that experience. Just for some context, my grandfather, or Mum's father, passed away 2 years ago from lung cancer. It was all very sudden. I was home alone earlier today, still living with my family, and everyone was out. We had a phone call downstairs. I don't usually answer the phone when home alone, unless I recognize the number. I saw the number on the home phone and didn't recognize it at all. Wasn't even a number from my country. I let it run through to the answering machine, and I heard a lot of people talking, almost like you'd hear in a cafeteria or busy restaurant. The message wasn't long, maybe 10 seconds, and towards the end I hear a voice that sounds exactly like my granddad saying, "Oi," down the phone. Regardless of who it was, they sounded happy. I was just wondering if anyone could confirm if my granddad was reaching out or has had any similar experience. My grandfather passed away recently. He was old and sick and in the hospital for nearly 2 months and a hospice for 2 days. It was horrible. My mum and aunt flew into town to say their goodbyes and deal with his belongings. My aunt returned home with his cell phone. She had it in her possession. It was dead and uncharged, and had never been charged since before his passing. He wasn't well enough to use it, and no one ever brought the charger to him from his house when he was at the hospital. It's an old flip phone. The number was disconnected for non-payment when I tried to call it. It just said the number is out of service or disconnected. Well, 2 nights ago, my grandfather's number called my mum and my aunt at the same time, 816. My mum didn't pick up the phone, and it left a weird voicemail. My aunt answered the phone. She said she heard sirens on the line, and then it hung up. They were both in hysterics and emotionally exhausted. I hope it never happens again.
A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone between 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it would be this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number, and after a month of it stopped. Then after a week or so it began again, the exact same noise, exact same time. Finally one day he decided to backdial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about, but still the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times and no messages were left. He decided to say screw it, ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. You guessed it. The screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening, he backdialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time he lost his job and his phone. The calls stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day my mum asks me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the screaming static. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He backdialed the number again and it said the number was disconnected this time. And then we never heard from it after that. I remember it was quite a cold afternoon, and considering I was getting ready for the gym, it probably was around 5:30 p.m. I remember that I was putting my gym towel in my backpack, along with a water bottle and some gloves. Before leaving the house, I went to the bathroom and locked the door. I should have mentioned I was alone in the house. My mum had left the house about an hour earlier to visit the grocery store. While I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I heard the phone ring. I was unable to answer it, so I just didn't care. But
It kept ringing for at least a full minute, until I heard someone lift the phone receiver. At first I tried thinking rationally, and I convinced myself that the noise I heard wasn't the receiver being lifted. A few seconds later, as I was about to get out of the bathroom, I heard someone putting the receiver back on the phone. I immediately froze and realized that someone was in the house. Without thinking rationally anymore, I quickly got out of the bathroom and started looking around the house. While being in my parents' bedroom, the phone started ringing again. This time I quickly rushed over to answer, but the ringing stopped right before I arrived in the hallway where the phone is. I heard the receiver being lifted again, and then I had the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life. I heard some footsteps coming from the hallway towards me, and I seriously thought I was going to be killed or kidnapped. I froze for a few seconds that felt like hours until the footsteps stopped. I peeked around the corner, and there was no one in the hallway. I sat down on the floor for a few minutes until I finally decided to take a look around the house again. I didn't find anyone or anything strange. I wanted to leave the house badly, but just before leaving I wanted to check on who called our phone. Turns out the last received call was in the morning. It was like the 2 calls I received never happened. By then I was seriously creeped out. I took my keys and went to the gym. When I returned, my mum was back home and I decided not to tell her anything about the footsteps and the phone call. Just as I dropped my backpack on the floor, my mum greeted me and said, "I think there's something wrong with my cell phone. I received 2 calls while I was shopping and couldn't answer them, and couldn't even find them in my call history." I told her I had no idea, and spent the rest of the day insanely creeped out. I even switched off my own cell phone and plugged out the phone before going to sleep. To this day, I have no explanation. To give you a bit of background before I begin my story, I started makeup and prosthetics for movies about 2 years after high school. My mum is currently starting makeup as well. My grandmother was extremely proud of us and would always show off our pictures to all of her friends. As with many of us, the 2020s hit hard. My gran moved to an old age home at the beginning of the year. Then a month or so later, she had fallen, got robbed with her house, thankfully she wasn't hurt, and finally she fell again and broke her hip, which meant she was sent to the hospital. Sadly, she passed away on December 13th. After her death, it took us a long time for us to recover, as we were very close to her. My mum and I got tattoos for my gran after her death with the words, "My Angel." We called her Ma, and the first 2 letters of my tattoos are in capitals that would spell out Ma. Well, fast forward to March this year, I was rushed to the hospital with severe stomach cramps. Turns out I had gallbladder stones and had to have surgery. The day before my surgery, my mum and brother come to visit me, and that's when she told me that my gran had phoned my brother's phone that morning. I thought my mum was lying, but when my brother showed me his call history, it was there. Her phone had called my brother's phone. I cried, thinking she was trying to tell me the surgery would be fine. Fast forward again to last week. My mum, who I mentioned before, is studying makeup, and for a particular look, she had to do her theme of mother of pearl and picked my gran. So last week she had to look in her portfolio. It looked stunning, and on the way home my mum and I shed a few tears. That night, as I was finishing up dinner, when I went to my brother to ask him something, I forget what it was, he told me that Ma's phone had called him again. Another thing to mention is that she had an iPhone, and my idiot of an uncle had blocked the phone so we couldn't open it, and the phone was dead. I showed my mum, and we were all amazed and took a screenshot of it. I've told a few friends about this, and they all say it's weird and come up with their own theories, but I fully believed she was looking down on us and just saying thank you. I understand there is the possibility that someone else could have her number, but why would it phone my brother, and on those specific days? I work in insurance. I investigate and inspect property claims, conduct site visits in the field, and typically call people about a half hour before arriving for an appointment just to make sure they remembered it and will be home. This particular claim I had was in Newcastle, about an hour north of Pittsburgh. I call the homeowner's home phone number to let them know I'm on my way. It's a very old-sounding woman who answers the phone. We have a very poor connection with a lot of static, and she keeps saying stuff like, "Hello? Can you hear me?" I say I'm gonna hang up and call back. When I call back immediately, no one answers. And then I call the cell phone and get a much younger sounding woman on the phone who tells me she's leaving the school where she just dropped her kids off and will be there shortly. I arrive at the house thinking someone else is home and ring the doorbell. About the same time, the homeowner pulls into the driveway. She's a young woman in her late 20s or early 30s and sounds absolutely nothing like the person who answered the phone. I comment to her that I called the house phone, but whomever answered couldn't hear me and said something like, "I'm sorry if I woke your mum up or whatever." She looks confused and said I must have the wrong number because no one was home. Wanting to make sure we have the right information, I read back the number I called, and she confirms it's the home phone number. She asked me what the lady sounded like. I told her it sounded like an old woman on the phone. She turns pale and looks very scared, telling me I'm freaking her out, because her family recently moved in, and she swears she has thoughts that the house is haunted by an old woman. At this point, the homeowner is very agitated about what happened, so I try to make sense of it and ask her if she thinks we should call the police in the event someone had broken into her house to answer the phone. I walk around the home checking the doors and windows, and the house seems secure. We enter, and she goes directly to her phone/answering machine. Her phone has caller ID, and sure enough, both of the calls from my number are on it. The first time I called, it shows that the call was answered, and the second shows the call was missed. So at this point, she's really freaking out about it because the caller ID shows that someone had answered the phone. Again, I ask her if she thinks we should call the police, thinking there may actually be an intruder who was nice enough to answer the phone. She declines and tells me about how she's been telling her husband she thinks the house is haunted, and how he has been making fun of her about it, and she's glad that someone else had experienced, but she's totally scared to death over it. The homeowner proceeds to tell me how strange things similar to this have been happening at the house, with a lot of activity taking place in the attic. Turns out the attic is exactly where I have to inspect for damage. She refused to go up with me, and just pointed to me in the right direction and stood at the bottom of the steps, nervously clutching a flashlight in her cell phone. I was pretty freaked out myself at this point, either expecting an intruder to jump out at me or see a phantom. I got out of there pretty quickly. Years later, I can still remember exactly what the old lady sounded like. I've tried rationalizing it, thinking it must have just been numbers getting crossed or whatever, but the caller ID showed it was from me. My mum died suddenly in 2019. She could never find her cell phone, so she was the only person in the world, I think, who still preferred the house phone for daily communication. That phone had been out of service since a few months after that. I had a bunch of missed calls on my phone from my best friend's mum, who also had a house phone, making sure that everything was okay. When I assured her it was, she told me she had 2 missed calls on her house phone with the caller ID of my mum's house phone and her name. She called back and it said the number was out of service. I assume there's a logical explanation and only just some spammer spoofing the number, but what are the chances of them calling someone I know? It really caught me off guard. I've been missing her a lot lately, and it's kind of throwing a loop for me. My friend says that she was just calling to say hi, and that she was okay or to get my attention. But why call my friend's mum, not me? And what would have happened if she'd have answered? Earlier today, I wanted to get out of the house. It's been raining here for almost a week on and off. So once I saw it was going to be sunny, I decided that we should go to the beach. I left my phone behind, which isn't unusual because I have a habit of dropping it at the beach or on hikes. We went to the beach and park, and I see a dog in a car parked near us and call my girlfriend to show her. As she approaches, her phone rings and I see on it the caller ID, name and number. She asks if I pocket dialed her and instinctively reach for my heaviest pockets, which had my wallet in it, but I remembered that I'd left my phone. I stop cold and tell her my phone is on the couch at home. She picks up and hears a deep voice speaking through static. I have a deep voice, but she told me she couldn't tell who it was or what they were saying before it hung up. She calls back and it rings before going to voicemail. I'm freaked out now because when we first met years ago, I had just moved to this town and saw myself on the street jogging. I ended up chasing this person but couldn't catch them. I kept trying to yell at my doppelgänger to get their attention, but they just kept going, putting more and more distance between us. I stopped and some nearby people commented on my twin I was racing. This further cemented what I saw. It was 100% me I was chasing, and now this? When we got home, my call log didn't have a history of a call outgoing, or the calls that she returned. Has anyone experienced anything like this? My family has experienced and encountered various apparitions throughout our lives, especially my parents and myself. One particular story I share often happened about 11 years ago to the day. My uncle, Dad's younger brother, drowned tragically in Lake Michigan. It was heartbreaking for all of us. The night he passed away, my immediate family gathered outside at night and sat around a fire just to process everything. As we were sitting there, my mum looked down and said, "Oh, it's 11:11. Say a little prayer for your uncle." My dad responded, "What about 11:11? My mum recoiled. "They say it's the time when the spirit world opens to this one." At that very minute, a huge, bright and clear shooting star flew by. It was an incredible sight. When the funeral came, we noticed that the minute the coffin was closed was 11:11. Fast forward to everything finishing up, funeral, burial, reception. We arrived back at our house, and when I got upstairs I noticed our answering machine had 2 messages on it. I checked and the first one was spam. The next one was at 11:11. It was written unknown name, unknown number. I played the message and there was nothing but a low hum of static. It was void of voice. I yelled for my family to come upstairs. We played it and checked the machine a bunch of times. Till this day, I don't think it was a coincidence. It was our uncle, saying he was okay, making some sort of peace. I usually share this story with close friends, but I'm happy I can do it here now too. This happened 2 years ago. A friend of mine was looking at houses in my city and had sent several of the online listings to me to give feedback as she was going to go through the process. She sent me one in particular that gave me terrible vibes. I noticed the tax history on the listing showed that it had been owned since it was built in the 70s and up until about 2005. After that, it was purchased and sold several times, each owner only having it for about a year or so. There wasn't anything in particular I could pinpoint, other than the hideously bland beige walls that I did not like, but the photos of the den and the living room gave me such a terrible vibe. All I could say was, I did not like the look of the house. I told her as much, and my friend admitted that something seemed odd about it to her as well. The following week I was down the street from the building I lived at the time, to get some lunch in a restaurant that I like to frequent, and she gave me a call. I already had my AirPods in my ears and was listening to music as I was eating when I answered. She told me she had a client meeting and didn't realize until it was over that she was only a mile or 2 from the home, so she had her realtor meet her there and they did a quick tour. She emphasized quickly, stating that as soon as she went through the door she regretted it. She began to describe the house and the feelings she had in there, when out of nowhere this terrible sound that was between a growl and a wail filled my ears. It was louder than my AirPods had been able to produce, even at the loudest volume setting. It physically hurt me. Without thinking, I grabbed them out of my ears and dropped them on the table. I had assumed it was a strange Bluetooth glitch, which can happen to wireless earbuds of any kind. When I took my AirPods out, the call automatically switched back over to the phone. I picked up and said, "Sorry," to my friend. As I was about to explain what happened, she stopped me and said, "What? You heard it too?" And we both talked about this horrible demonic sound that sounded like an angry voice but much deeper and gravelier. I admitted I just thought it was my earbuds glitching. We both took a moment and I told her that there was nothing but bad energy in that house and that she should probably run by a shop that sold sage and sage herself before driving home. Several days later, I mentioned it to a realtor friend of mine and she asked me what the address was. I didn't know but described the location of the house and some info I had on it. She got out her laptop and was able to find it quickly. Glancing through the info, and when she saw the tax record, she says, "Yeah, there's absolutely something wrong with it. It's rare to see so many sales and resales within such a short amount of time." She also told me that while she personally didn't believe in ghosts, she knows that things that happened in houses leave imprints. She often shows houses that have wonderful and uplifting energies and knows that there was a lot of happiness and love in that house. She also comes across homes that have very dark and heavy energies, and she knows that bad things have happened there in the past.
I had a weird encounter with a dark shadow-like figure and a white almost glowing figure as a child. Maybe this is important for later. Around the year of 2019, towards the end of it, I was at a birthday party of a friend. The party was in a small cabin in the woods, which is a popular party location for German teenagers. The evening was long, and I drank a little bit of alcohol, so did my boyfriend. His mother said that she would pick us up, and around 1 a.m. I called her. I stood a few meters away from the other guests and called her to let her know we wanted to go. It was definitely her phone number because of her picture and her name, and it showed up like that in my call log. When she picked us up, the following conversation happened. "Hey, it's me. Can you pick us up now? Danny's tired," as in my boyfriend. "That would be very nice." She replies, mumble, mumble, mumble. "Huh?" Then she goes in an eerie voice that didn't sound either male or female. "I'm sick. I'm going to find you." That was a very strange interaction. She's not the kind of person to make strange jokes like that. What really scared me was her voice. I never heard such an eerie voice, so I immediately started running to the other guests and told them what happened. I told them I felt like I was in one of those cheesy horror movies, but no one believed me. The boys tried to find rational answers, like I imagined certain things or the connection was bad or I'd called someone else, but I can prove it was her, since it showed up like that on the call log. One girl came up and told me she believed me and hugged me. I knew the boys believed me too, since I never pranked. Then his mum called again. I told her what happened and she was really confused and told me she didn't know what happened and that my boyfriend's dad was going to collect us. When he came, I told him the story and burst out into tears, which I never did in front of them. I was very scared. We then looked for rational answers. His mum said she was watching a movie on her iPad and that maybe the call connected. So she rewatched the movie, but it had no such lines and it was a comedy after all. I still don't know what happened that night. Nothing like it ever happened again. The only thing that happened since were unlucky things in terms of my health, which I don't think are really related to this. Has anyone ever had an incident with a mysterious caller?
Oh, hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. Wow, well done for making it to the end. I think this video is almost twice the length of a regular video. The edits are going to be insane. 37 stories. I might not have called it that in the title, but damn, it was a hell of a lot of work. I really hope that you guys do enjoy the video. Probably took a hell of a time to edit as well. Shorter stories tend to be far more difficult than longer stories for some reason, and I am now very tired. But thank you all for tuning in to the first installment in Paranormal Week. It should be fun. I want to do a collection of all ghost and spooky stories in the hopes that you like it. But with that being said, I think I'm going to leave it here for now. Hopefully, see you again soon. And a huge thank you as always to my members and patrons, whose names are on screen now. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.